Okay, so let's go ahead and build a currency conversion class. This is going to allow us to convert multiple amounts at the same time among different currencies. And we'll see how that works in a moment. But let's talk about the API that we're going to be using. This is the free currency converter API. There are lots of APIs that you can use to convert currency. I wanted to choose one that was free, so you wouldn't have to sign up or pay for it. And this one is completely open to personal and commercial use as well, which is really good. So we'll take a look at some of the examples in a moment, but let's look at the actual code that we get out of this class. So you can see here I've namespaced this class under Codecourse utilities. You don't have to do this, but the class name is currency converter, and obviously we're creating a new instance of this here. And what we have then is two methods that we can use, and you can implement more methods if your API allows for additional functionality. This is probably the one that we're most interested in. So we're using converter, which we have instantiated up here, and we're using convert. And you can see here we're passing through an array, and that array contains lots of different arrays. We can have as many of these as we want. And what that'll do is it will return to you the results in the same order, and it will give you a USD to GBP, so dollars to pounds conversion for this value, and a pounds to dollars conversion of this value. And obviously you can use any currencies available from that API. And we were also going to implement a method called getCurrencies, which allows us to grab all of the currencies that are available in that API. So that's really handy to do as well. So let's go straight over to coding this up. We're going to be building an interface, so coding to an interface. And the reason for that is that the service that you use may change, but you may still want to implement the same methods. So we're going to be forcing the class that we build to adhere to this sort of structure. So let's go ahead and start writing the code here. So starting out with just an index.php file, let's just, in the same directory here, create our interface. You don't need to do this, but it's a good idea. Like I said, there are lots of different API services, and you want to keep this consistent throughout your application, regardless of which service you use. So if you create a new class to handle currency conversion from another service, if one service, say, fails or goes down or is no longer available, at least then you have that contract to adhere to. So we're going to call this currency converter interface, and this is really, really simple. We just say interface, we give it a name, and then we implement the methods that we want to see in any class that implements this interface. So the first one then is convert. This is going to take an array of conversions, so any amount of conversions that we want to do. And then we want a method called getCurrencies, just in case we want to list the available currencies somehow. So I'm going to namespace this under Codecourse utilities, but again, you don't need to do this. So now that we've got that, let's require this into our index file. In reality, you wouldn't do this, you wouldn't pull in your interface, you'd have some way of auto-loading this, but in this case, we'll just pull it in now. And now let's actually create the class that we're going to be building, which contains the functionality. So that's just going to be called currency converter. And the class name is currency converter, obviously, and that's going to implement currency converter interface. So what we're now going to do is on the index page, we're going to pull in currency converter.php, and you'll now see that we get an error. That's because that's not being found. Let's have a look here. We didn't namespace this, so namespace this under Codecourse utilities. Okay, so now we'll get a different error altogether, which is that the currency converter contains two abstract methods and must therefore be declared abstract, or implement the remaining methods, which is essentially a way of saying these methods have not been implemented into this class here. So let's define these out now. This one's called convert, and remember that takes an array, so we can say array conversions. This is just type hinting it, so if an array isn't passed, it'll give us an error. And we also want get currencies. We'll leave get currencies till last because this isn't necessarily important. It's just more of a nice to have. But we'll implement the conversion functionality first. So remember, this is going to convert multiple, or you could just pass in one currency conversion if you really wanted to. It doesn't matter. So let's take a look at the API that we're going to be working with. We've got a compact output sample here, and let's examine the structure of what we get back here. This is really important. Now, I'm using an extension in my browser to render this JSON output in a nice way. If you're not using one, you'll probably get an output that looks something like this. So if you are using a browser that supports extensions and there's a JSON output extension available, I'd highly recommend you grab that, and then it's just a little bit easier to work with the content that you get output on the page. So in the URL then, let's look at the structure. So it's obviously this domain name, API version 2, and then the endpoint here is convert. And then we pass in a query. The query contains the currency we want to convert from, and then the currency we want to convert to. This is PHP, so it is a currency. It doesn't mean PHP as in the language. And then we can pass this additional compact yes. So if we don't pass compact, we'll get the following. So what we're going to do is we're going to stick with the compact view just so it's a little bit easier to work with. Now you can notice that what we're not doing here is we're not passing in an amount, and the reason for that is that this is just going to return $1 by default to this currency. So if we, for example, say what is £1 to US dollars, well, that's 1.5 US dollars. So what we're going to have to do is multiply this value inside of our convert method to the amount we want to see. So for example, if you wanted to know what £2 was in dollars, it would just be this times 2. Pretty straightforward. So what we're going to do then is we're going to actually grab the URL just from here to here, so not including the convert endpoint, and we're going to store this in a property at the top of our class. So this is going to be called currency URL. This just makes it easier to reuse it wherever we need to. So I'm going to get rid of the trailing slash there. And what we're also going to do is we're going to say we want the convert endpoint to be something. So with this, we're not just going to say convert, we're going to include all of this. So we can just paste that in there. But obviously this needs to change at some point, this query. So this is the query part of the query string. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a placeholder in there, which we can replace later with sprintf, the sprintf function in PHP. So we've got this stored up here so we can again make use of this and reuse it. Okay, so let's get going about the conversions then. The first thing I want to do is define a query, an empty query up here, and also an empty result set. Now the query is going to be whatever we would put in here, but multiple of these. So for example, if we wanted to find out the conversion rate of GBP and USD, we would say GBP, USD, and then USD, GBP, like so. And then that gives us both conversions, so we can pass multiple conversions to the API. So what we want to do then is we want to build up that query, and essentially it's going to end up looking like USD, GBP, comma, and then whatever else you're doing. So what we need to do then is implode this by a comma. So I'm going to say query equals implode, and I'm going to implode something by a comma. Now we can't use the traditional passing in conversions here to actually pull this back, because what we've got is on our index page, if we were to start building it up, we're going to have, remember, an array with multiple arrays inside of it, comma separated. So that's a little bit awkward. Let's actually start to define this out just before we write this. It's probably a good idea. So let's say converter equals new Codecourse utilities currency converter, and then we're going to say results equals converter convert, and then we pass an array in there, remember, and that array is going to contain more arrays with the first, what you want to convert it to, and then the value. So let's duplicate this down then and reverse this, GBP to USD, and then let's change this to something like £200, and obviously the pence or whatever else works. Okay, so we've got these two. So inside of the currency converter, we can close off this interface now. We can't do something like implode comma conversions, because remember, conversions is a multi-dimensional array. So if we, for example, do a var dump on query now, that's going to give us back, if we just pull this over, well, it's going to give us array to string conversion error, because these contain arrays, so it's a little bit more complicated than we might want. So in this case, we use array map, and we are going to pass in a closure here, and then as an argument here, we want to pass in the conversions that we get from here. Now, for each loop of this array map, it's going to map over the array. It's going to return something. So what we can do here is return a string, which is going to be the first currency that we want to convert from, and then what we want to convert to. So we need to give each of them a name. So we can say C, and then in here we can see something like C0. We know that the from is at the 0 key. And then we can say C1. So essentially this is going to be like US dollars to pounds, or pounds to US dollars, or whatever. So now if we var dump the query, we get the following. So we get USD GBP, comma separated with GBP USD. So that is working just perfectly. So now what we can do is start to actually build up the URL that we want to access. So build up URL. So the convert endpoint, we're going to store another variable locally. We're not overwriting this. That is going to be sprintf, and this allows us to pass in a string, which is going to be this convert endpoint. So we're actually now pulling this value down, and then at the end of this, we can replace the s here, which essentially is a string, with another value, and in this case it's just the query, because we're popping the query into there. So let's echo out the convert endpoint, and let's go ahead and refresh, and there we go. So we've got convert q equals US dollar GBP, GBP USD, exactly like we saw before. So now that we've got the URL, we want to, or the endpoint, we want to build up the actual URL. So URL, this is really, really easy. All we want to do here is pull in this currency URL, which is obvious, that's this here. And then we want a /, and then we want convert endpoint. So then that gives us, if we just stick an echo on the front there, the following. So we can paste this in just to test it. So let's come over here and paste that into here. And there we go. So we know that this works now. We're building up the URL. Now all we need to do is actually use curl to make a request to that URL and pull back the response. And we want to then JSON decode it, because we're getting JSON. Curl will obviously return a string to us, and we can use JSON decode to then loop through that and build up our results that will return from this convert method. So what we're going to do is we're going to extract this to a method, because it doesn't really belong in the conversion. Making a curl request isn't part of a conversion, so we want to separate the concerns throughout the methods. So we're going to say get response, and the response is going to be this curl request passing in the URL. But obviously this method doesn't exist. So down here, let's create a protected function, curl request, and that obviously takes a URL. We don't necessarily need to apply it in the interface because if you think about it, a curl request isn't really part of a currency converter. If you use another service that you maybe don't need to make a curl request to, then you don't need to bother. You know, you might say have some kind of local service running. I don't know. But that's why we're creating this in here, but not defining it in the interface, if you were wondering. So let's create a curl instance, or a curl resource rather. So we use curl init for that. And then what we're going to do is set some options. So curl set opt. And the first one is going to be curl opt return transfer true. And then we want to define the URL. So it's a little bit long-winded, but we'll get there eventually. Okay, so that's all we need to do. And then we want to return, using the curl exec function. So we're going to execute this, and we pass in the resource here that we created and set options for. And this is how we define what instance we want to set options for. So that's now going to return the actual response body of the request to this URL. So what we can now do is either echo or just do a var dump, maybe that might be a little bit more sensible, on the response. So now what we'll get is the following. So this is giving us a string because we still need to JSON encode it, but you can see that we've got a JSON string here with the values that we would expect back. You can see that they match up perfectly there. So what do we do with this response then? Well, we can wrap this in JSON encode, and we want this as an array. By default, this will come back as an object. So we pass the second option as true. That gives us an array back. And now you can see that we have the following. So we've got a, we need to decode it, not encode it. If you're wondering, encode will take an array and make it into a JSON string that you can then pass off to somewhere. But in our case, we're getting a JSON string, so we need to decode it in order to turn it into an array. So there we go. So we've got what we need. We've got the key here for the actual type of conversion, so USD to GBP, and then we've got the value just here. So now that we've actually got the response, we need to think about how we need to loop and actually multiply the value that we got back from USD GBP to 12, or by 12, and then GBP to USD by 200. And obviously, because we're going to be looping, this applies for any amount of conversions that you want to do. Because at the moment, we're just getting back the one GBP to USD and one USD to GBP. So what we now want to do is build up the results. That's fairly straightforward. All we need to do is a for each loop on the conversions as C. Obviously, we're not going to loop through each of the items we get back from the response because they're not going to match the values that we've given. Now, the reason that is because if, for example, I was to say duplicate USD GBP, we don't get another key here for GBP or USD GBP because there'd be no need to return another one of these. We already know the value. So we loop through the initial arrays that we pass through to the convert method. And in here, what we want to do is, this may not make sense initially, but what we want to do is we want to build up what that key would look like. So this key then is basically going to be USD underscore GBP for the first loop, and then it'll be GBP USD or underscore USD for the second loop. And the reason we want to do that is because we want to dive into this key here and then pick up the val property. Obviously, we're working with an array, so I'm referring to these as keys, these two as keys, but in reality, these are properties, or this is an object, this is a property. So now that we've done that, then we want to append to our results. Remember, we set an empty results array up here. So the results, and this is just appending another item onto this array. What we want to do first of all is check if the key is set. Now the reason we want to do that is because if, for example, we pass in, I don't know, something silly like 1, 2, 3, this won't give us back a record for USD 1, 2, 3, obviously. So if we're then looping again and checking that, it's not going to exist. So we need to check if, as part of the response, which remember is an array now, the key exists there. Then, and I'm using a ternary operator here, we want to grab the response at that particular key and the value for that conversion. So what that's going to do now, if we just do a var dump on results, that's going to give us, of course, so obviously otherwise we want to just return either null or whatever you want to do. Nulls probably make sense. And there we go. So now what we've done is we've got a float here at key 0, and at key or index 1 we've got float here. So these are the actual conversion amounts that are coming back from here. So 0.63, 1.58, so they match up. Okay, so obviously that's not great because we're looking for $12 to GBP and 200 GBP to USD. So at some point here we need to actually multiply this. So what I'm going to do is multiply this by C2. So basically C, remember, is this, and then C is this for the next loop. That's why we're grabbing C0, C1, and now we can actually grab the amount, and that's represented by C2 because it's at the key 2. Obviously, arrays are 0 indexed. Okay, so now that we've done that, we're actually multiplying that value. So when I refresh, you can see that we get the actual expected value. So we can test this out. So $12 to GBP, just to make sure we've not done any calculations wrong. If we go back to the home page here, it gives us a tryout bit. So what were we doing? 12 USD to GBP, 7.574, 7.574, and then the next one was 200 GBP to USD. So 200 GBP to USD, convert that, 31690, 3169. You can obviously, when you're outputting these in your application, use the number_format function in PHP, and the second argument will take the amount of decimal places or leading zeros or leading numbers. Okay, so now that we've done that, rather than var dump the results, we want to return the results. And then on index.php, we now have the results. So again, I'm just going to var dump them here. I'm not going to show you how you would use them because that's pretty straightforward. We now just have an array on the index page. So you can then go ahead and use these results however you need. If you're just converting one value, that's fine. You would just have this. You would refresh or whatever, and then you'd obviously access the value here. So you can just do var dump results 0, and that's obviously going to give you a float of that number. So you could just, I suppose, echo that out if you wanted to. And there we go. So we've done the actual conversion, but now we're just going to quickly implement the get currencies method, just in case we wanted to get a list of currencies available to be able to convert. So here we see list of all currencies. So it's very, very, very straightforward. Remember, we stored this URL already, but the endpoint for all currencies is just currencies. So let's define this up here. So the currencies endpoint is this. And now that we've got that in here, all we want to do is build up the URL. So remember, we're going to do exactly the same thing as we did just here, but we're going to change this very, very slightly. So we're going to say currency URL / this currencies URL. Let's just see, currencies endpoint, sorry, not URL. So we can just paste that in there. So we've now got that URL. Remember that we already have the curl request method extracted out here. So all we need to do is return this curl request URL. But obviously that's not all we want to do. We want to JSON decode it because it's a string, not an array that we can actually work with. Passing in true because we want an array back. And you'll notice that this is this object here is results. So we want to sort of bypass that because within our application we don't want to have to be going into results. So all we can do at the end of here is just stick results on. And now what we can do is if we just comment this out down here, we could say let's do a var dump on converter get currencies. And while we're at it, let's just wrap some pre-tags around this just to preserve the formatting. And there we go, simple as that. So if you did need to loop through these, or rather than loop through them, well, you could loop through them, but if you wanted to check a particular currency is available, you could go ahead and work with that array as you normally would. So that is how straightforward it is really to just create a small class that, remember, is coded to an interface, so you know that these methods should always be available regardless of the service that you're using within the convert method to actually grab the data. As long as you're returning the results in the same format, then it won't affect your application in the future. It's always a good idea, rather than writing very procedural code and it gets messy, it gets hard to maintain. You've now got a nice little class that you can just use whenever you need to. So these API calls have been made to this website. Again, it's completely and utterly free, but obviously in the future it may not exist, and that's happened with the Google Currency Conversion API. There are other API services that you can use as well. Some are paid, some are free. There are some that return results in XML format, which is really, really tricky to work with. So if you can, try and find a API that returns JSON, and then obviously in PHP it's a lot easier to work with because you can just use JSON decode. And because this is free, it's a good idea to go ahead and just donate to the author. So as you can see, you can send a little donation and just support this project. It's always good when someone's offering something for free to go ahead and support a product. So that is how we do simple currency conversion with PHP by building a small lightweight class to handle that for us.